The silence in Esther Hale's cabin wasn't just silence. It was a thing. A heavy blanket of grief that had smothered every other sound for a year, ever since she'd buried her husband, Walter. Now, the only things that moved were the dust motes, dancing in the thin shafts of Wyoming sunlight. And the only sound was the wind, howling outside like a lost soul. Esther was a widow in a town called Redemption, a place that had long ago forgotten the meaning of the word. To the townsfolk, she was a ghost, a fragile thing, waiting to be broken by the harsh land. They didn't see the steel in her spine, but even she could feel it starting to rust. Her life was a circle of chores: wake, tend the dying garden, mend clothes that no longer smelled like the man she loved, sleep, repeat. It was a Tuesday when the circle finally broke. The pantry was bare. The hunger in her stomach was a dull ache, a pale echo of the emptiness in her heart. She had $5 to her name. Her last $5. With a sigh that seemed to pull up rocks from the bottom of her soul, she wrapped her worn shawl around her shoulders and began the long walk into town. Something was wrong. Redemption was buzzing, but not with the usual gossip and commerce. This was a different energy. It was cruel. A crowd was gathered in the main square, a knot of men with hungry, leering faces, and on a makeshift stage stood Garrett Vance. Vance was a man who built his fortune on the backs of broken people. His smile was a greasy stain on his fat face, and next to him, in heavy iron chains, was a man. He wasn't just a man, he was a monument to ruin. Tall, broad-shouldered, his body a roadmap of scars. His face was a mess of bruises and cuts, but his eyes were on fire. They burned with a defiance that the chains and the jeers couldn't touch. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He just stood there, like a mountain. "A champion fighter," Vance bellowed, yanking the chain like he was showing off livestock. "Ran afoul of some debts, but his loss is your gain. Strong back, knows how to take a beating." The crowd jeered and laughed. $10 to start," Vance yelled. "Who'll give me 10 for this prime specimen?" The bids were insults. $3, $4. They were haggling over a man's life like he was a lame horse. A sickness churned in Esther's gut. This was Redemption, a town that feasted on misery. She looked at the man in chains, and she saw her own prison, her own grief, her own loneliness. And then something inside her snapped. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a plan. It was a lightning strike of pure, raw defiance. Defiance against Vance, against the town, against the crushing silence of her life. $5, she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. Every head in the crowd turned, every eye fixed on her, the widow Hale, the little church mouse. Garrett Vance squinted, his piggy eyes finally finding her. A slow, oily smirk spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. "The little church mouse has a roar." He savored the moment, letting her hang in the wind of 100 stares. $5, she says. Going once? Going twice? The world stopped. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs. What had she done? "Sold!" Vance roared, slamming his hand down. "To the widow Hale for the grand sum of $5." The crowd erupted in laughter. Esther's hand flew to her mouth. The full, crushing weight of her decision slammed into her. She had just spent her last dollar on a broken, scarred, and very dangerous man. Vance unlocked the chain from the post and tossed a heavy iron key into the dust at Esther's feet. "He's all yours, madam," he sneered. "Do try not to get yourself killed." She bent down, her fingers trembling as she picked up the key. The crowd melted away, their laughter echoing in the square, and Esther was left alone, facing the stranger she had just bought. The walk back to her cabin was the longest mile of her life. He followed a few paces behind her, silent. The only sound was the rhythmic clink-clank of his chains. It was a death knell. Esther didn't dare look back. She could feel his presence, a massive shadow at her heels. The sun beat down, turning the dusty road into a furnace. The silence between them was thick with fear and 1,000 unspoken questions. She had invited a wolf into her home, and she was a lone sheep. When they finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller, weaker than ever before, a flimsy box of wood against the vast, unforgiving landscape. "You can get a drink," she managed to say, her voice a dry croak. She pointed a trembling finger at the water pump. He moved to it, his back muscles rippling under his torn shirt as he worked the handle. He drank like a man who hadn't seen clean water in a year, then splashed it over his face, washing away layers of grime and dried blood. Esther stood on the porch, the heavy iron key sweating in her palm. This was it. The moment of truth. To leave him in chains was a cruelty she couldn't stomach. But to free him, to unshackle that immense, unknown power, it was a gamble that could cost her life. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely fit the key into the lock on his ankle chains. He watched her, his fiery eyes unblinking, tracking her every move. She took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass and knelt in the dirt before him. The lock was rusted shut. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it wouldn't turn. Then, with a tortured screech of metal, it clicked open. She moved to his wrists. The iron was cold against her skin. This lock gave way more easily. The chains fell. They hit the dust with a heavy final clang that echoed in the dead quiet. He was free. Esther scrambled backward, kicking up dust, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. She expected him to run, or worse, to lunge, to finish the job Vance had started. He was bigger, stronger, a man made of violence. She was nothing. But he didn't run, he didn't attack. He did something that made the world tilt on its axis. Slowly, deliberately, he sank to one knee in the dirt before her. He bowed his head for a moment, like a knight before his monarch. Then he looked up, and the fire in his eyes had changed. The defiance was gone. In its place was a look of such profound, soul-shaking reverence that it stole the air from her lungs. "My queen," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse, but it was clear and steady. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a vow. Esther just stared, her mind a spinning vortex of confusion. This broken fighter, this caged animal, was kneeling at her feet, looking at her as if she held the power of life and death. And in that moment, the lonely widow of redemption felt the first crack appear in the ice that had encased her heart for a year. Something had just changed forever. A new kind of silence settled over the homestead in the days that followed. It wasn't the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of observation. The man, who eventually told her his name was Caleb, spoke only when necessary. His words were few, but his actions were a constant, flowing conversation. He rose before dawn. By the time Esther stepped out of her cabin, a perfect stack of chopped firewood would be waiting for her. He had found Walter's old axe, its head rusted and dull, and sharpened it on a river stone until it gleamed. He slept on the porch, refusing her offer of a bed inside. He became a sentinel, a silent guardian whose very presence seemed to push back the darkness at the edge of her land. He mended the broken fence that had sagged since Walter's passing. He weeded her pathetic garden with a tenderness that seemed impossible for his scarred, calloused hands. He fixed the squeaking hinge on her front door, a small sound that had been a daily reminder of her slow decay. Esther watched him, her fear slowly replaced by a deep, unsettling curiosity. He was an enigma, a man of brutal contradictions. He was a warrior who moved with the grace of a monk, a prisoner who worked with the dedication of a free man repaying a sacred debt. One evening, she saw him by the water pump, trying to stitch a new tear in his tattered shirt with a clumsy piece of twine. Without a word, she took it from him. She sat on the porch steps, the evening light fading to purple, and mended it with neat, even stitches. When she handed it back, he didn't thank her. He just held the shirt, his gaze fixed on the tidy seam, a strange light flickering in his dark eyes. The next morning, a single desert primrose was sitting on her windowsill, a tiny, defiant splash of pink against the brown, dusty world. She knew. She put it in a glass of water, and its small, vibrant life seemed to fill the entire cabin. They started sharing meals. Not at the same table, not at first. She'd leave a plate on the porch. But soon, he began to sit at the far end of the rough-hewn table outside, always waiting for her to take the first bite before he would eat. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was a space of shared understanding. One night, as the crickets began their song, she found herself talking about Walter. The words just came, a quiet river of memories about his kindness, his laugh, his stubborn faith in this hard land. Caleb just listened. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He just listened. He bore witness to her grief in a way no one else had. She started to see past the scars and the silence. She saw the deep weariness in his eyes, a pain so old it had become a part of him. This was a man who had been broken into 1,000 pieces by the world, but had somehow managed to hold on to a core of honor that was stronger than steel. The fear was gone. In its place, something fragile and green was beginning to grow. Trust. One night, for the first time in a year, she went to bed and did not slide the heavy bolt across her door. She knew the guardian was on her porch, and she felt safe. But their small island of peace was surrounded by an ocean of suspicion. The town of redemption was simmering. The widow Hale's reckless purchase was the scandal of the season. Her living with the fighter was a source of whispered, ugly gossip. They saw sin. They saw madness. Garrett Vance, especially, was not a man to forget a humiliation. He'd been made a fool of. A mousy widow had bought his champion fighter for a pittance, and worse, he'd heard that her ramshackle property was now showing signs of life. The fence was straight. The woodpile was high. It was an insult. The man he had owned was now enriching the woman who had defied him. One afternoon, the peace was shattered by the thunder of hooves. Vance and 2 of his hired thugs reined their horses in at the newly mended gate. His eyes, small and mean, swept over the tidy yard, the garden, and landed on Caleb, who had stopped his work and stood watching them, utterly still. "Well now, Widow Hale," Vance called out, his voice dripping with false concern. "Just came to check on you. Worried this animal of yours might have caused some trouble." He spat into the dust, his eyes locked on Caleb. Esther came out onto the porch, her hands clenched into fists. "We are just fine, Mr. Vance. We don't need your help." Vance's smile turned ugly. "Oh, I think you do. See, that man is my property. I sold him in a moment of generosity. But a deal made in public, under duress from a woman. It ain't binding." His men snickered. "I'm thinking I made a mistake," Vance said, his voice dropping low. "I'm thinking I'm taking him back." One of his men, a lanky man with a cruel slit for a mouth, swung off his horse and started for the gate. "Come on, boy. Time to go back in your cage." Caleb didn't move a muscle. "He is not your property," Esther said, her voice shaking but clear as a bell. "I paid for him. He is a free man." "Is he now?" Vance sneered. "Let's just see." The thug unlatched the gate and stepped onto their land. He reached a grimy hand for Caleb's arm. And that's when it happened. The quiet, gentle gardener vanished. The champion fighter returned. But this wasn't the wild rage of a caged animal. This was something else entirely. It was cold. It was fast. It was terrifying. Caleb moved like smoke. One moment the thug was reaching for him. The next he was flat on his back in the dirt, gasping for air, his wrist bent at an angle it was never meant to bend. Before the second man could even think about drawing his pistol, Caleb had moved again. A blur of motion, a twist, and the man's gun was flying through the air, landing uselessly in the weeds. The man himself was on his knees, clutching a shoulder that had been wrenched from its socket. It was over in seconds. It wasn't a brawl. It was a disassembly. Caleb hadn't thrown a single punch. He used their own weight, their own momentum, against them. It was a chilling, beautiful, brutal ballet. Then, Caleb turned his cold, flat gaze on Garrett Vance, who sat on his horse, his face the color of chalk. Caleb took one slow step forward. That was all it took. Vance ripped his reins, his horse rearing in panic, and galloped away in a cloud of dust and shame, his two men stumbling after him. Caleb watched them go, his chest rising and falling. Then the killer bled out of him, and he turned to look at Esther on the porch. The quiet guardian was back. But everything had changed. A line had been drawn in the dust. Vance's hatred hadn't broken them. It had forged them together. This was no longer just her home. It was theirs. And Esther knew, with a cold certainty that seeped into her bones, that Garrett Vance would be back, and he would not come alone. The quiet that fell after Vance's retreat was worse than the noise. It was heavy, pregnant with violence. The sky itself seemed to be holding its breath, gathering dark clouds on the horizon. A storm was coming. Vance's pride was a snake, and they had stepped on it. He wouldn't just bring thugs next time. He'd bring an army. As Esther secured the shutters that evening, the air grew thick, electric. Caleb worked around the cabin, his movements economical and precise. He reinforced the door. He checked the stability of the porch posts. He moved the heavy wood-chopping axe from the stump to a spot just inside the door. His silence was different now. It was the focused quiet of a soldier preparing for battle. As darkness fell, she found him on the porch, staring out at the approaching storm. For the first time, she saw a flicker of that old pain in his eyes, the weariness of a man who had fought too many wars. "He will bring more men," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Caleb replied, his voice a low rumble. "Why are you still here?" she finally asked, the question that had lived between them for weeks. "You're a free man. You could be miles from here. Why stay and fight for me?" He finally turned from the horizon and looked at her. The intensity in his gaze was a physical force. "Because," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "when every other person in that square saw an animal, you saw a man. You bought my freedom with the last $5 you had in the world. In the life I came from, a debt like that is a blood oath." He took a small step closer, and the porch suddenly felt as small as a lifeboat in a vast ocean. "I was a fighter, yes, but not by choice. I was sold into it as a boy to men like Vance. They bet on my pain. I fought because if I didn't, I would die. The only thing I ever truly owned was my honor, my loyalty, and I gave it to you." His jaw tightened. "They called me a champion, but I was a champion for kings I despised. There is no honor in that. I would rather be a soldier for a queen I respect." The raw, simple truth of his words washed over her, extinguishing the last embers of her fear and igniting a fierce, blazing resolve. He wasn't her protector. He was her partner. They weren't a victim and her beast. They were a fortress, and they would not fall. "My husband," she said, her voice suddenly strong, left a shotgun above the hearth. "He taught me how to use it." Caleb's eyes met hers, and in that moment a new pact was sealed. Not in words, but in the silent promise of shared battle. They were in this together. The attack came just before midnight, hidden under the cloak of the storm. The rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The wind screamed. Vance, drunk on whiskey and rage, brought 5 men this time. They carried torches, their flames sputtering in the deluge. Their plan was simple and vile. If they couldn't take the man, they would burn the woman out. But Caleb was waiting. He didn't meet them in the open yard. He used the storm. He used the darkness. He became a ghost, a thing of shadow and rain. There was a sudden, sickening crunch of bone, a man's scream instantly devoured by a clap of thunder. He moved among them, not like a brawler, but like a predator. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was extermination. From the cabin window, Esther saw one of them break through. He was running for the wall with his torch held high. Her heart hammered, but her hands were rock steady as she lifted Walter's heavy shotgun. She remembered his patient voice, the weight of his hand on her shoulder as he showed her how to aim. Breathe. Aim. Squeeze. The blast was a deafening roar that shook the small cabin. The man outside shrieked and fell, his torch hissing out in a muddy puddle. The shot revealed her position. Vance, his face a mask of fury, charged the porch himself, a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand. Caleb appeared from the darkness to meet him. The two men crashed into each other like freight trains. It was Vance's brute, drunken strength against Caleb's cold, calculated skill. They slammed against the porch posts, a whirlwind of mud and violence. Esther watched in horror, her fingers fumbling as she tried to reload. She saw Vance's knife arm break free. He was going for a killing blow. There was no time for the gun. She dropped it. She spun around, grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, and burst through the door. She swung it with every ounce of strength she had. The skillet connected with the side of Vance's head with a sound like a cracked melon. His eyes went wide with disbelief. His grip on Caleb slackened for a single, crucial second. It was all Caleb needed. He twisted, using Vance's own weight to throw him off balance. Vance stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the rain-slicked wood. He fell from the porch, and his head hit the corner of the stone well with a final, wet crack. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining thugs, seeing their leader fall, broke. They scrambled away into the storm, vanishing like rats into the night. The rain began to soften. The thunder rolled away into the distance. The war was over. They had won. Dawn broke, pale and clean, over a world washed new by the storm. The body of Garrett Vance was a grim, silent reminder of the night's fury. It was a problem for another time. A problem for the town sheriff. Inside the cabin, Esther gently cleaned a cut above Caleb's eye with a damp cloth. He sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving her face. The violence of the night had burned away everything between them but the raw, unbreakable truth. They were bound together by something stronger than blood. When she finished, he reached up and took the cloth from her, his thumb brushing her knuckles. The small touch sent a jolt of warmth through her, a current of life that chased away the last of the night's chill. But as Caleb looked at the body by the well, his expression wasn't one of relief. It was grim. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "Vance is dead," Esther replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "Vance was a dog," Caleb said, turning his intense gaze back to her. "But he had a master, a man far richer and more powerful than him. This man will not care that Vance is dead. He will only care that I am still alive, and that I am here." A new, colder fear began to creep into Esther's heart. They hadn't just killed a local bully. They had poked a sleeping dragon. "Who?" she whispered. "His name is Silas Croft," Caleb said. "He owns the railroad. He owns the mines. He thinks he owns everything and everyone in this territory, including me." The pieces began to click into place. The bad debts Vance had mentioned. This wasn't about money. "I wasn't just his fighter," Caleb explained. "I was his enforcer, his personal weapon. I did things for him, things I am not proud of. But I saw too much. I learned his secrets. When I tried to leave, he put a bounty on my head so high that every scoundrel from here to the Mississippi wanted a piece of me. Vance didn't catch me. I let him." Esther stared at him, confused. "You let him?" "I was tired of running," Caleb admitted, a deep weariness in his voice. I thought a quick end in a fighting pit was better than a slow one on the run. I never expected you. He looked around the small, tidy cabin, at the primrose, still vibrant in its glass, at the neatly patched shirt he wore. You gave me something to protect, something to fight for, instead of just fighting to survive. Just then, a rider appeared on the horizon. A single rider, moving fast. Not a thug. This one wore a badge, Sheriff Brody. A wave of relief washed over Esther. The law had arrived. They could explain what happened. It was self-defense. The sheriff reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene. Vance's body, the broken gate, the blood on the porch. His gaze fell on Caleb, and his hand slowly went to the pistol on his hip. "Caleb Donovan," the sheriff said, his voice cold and hard. "You're under arrest for the murder of Garrett Vance." Esther's relief curdled into disbelief. "Murder? Sheriff, it was self-defense. He attacked us. He brought 5 men." Sheriff Brody didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on Caleb. "I have a warrant here, signed by Judge Miller himself, issued on the authority of Mr. Silas Croft. It seems Mr. Croft's prized fighter ran away, and now he's turned up here, having murdered one of Mr. Croft's business associates." It was a lie. A neat, tidy, legally binding lie. Croft had outmaneuvered them. He was using the law as his own personal weapon. "You can't do this," Esther pleaded. "Ma'am, step aside," the sheriff warned, drawing his gun. Caleb looked at Esther. In his eyes, she saw not fear, but a grim resignation. He had known this was coming. He slowly raised his hands. "Don't fight," he said to her, his voice calm. "This is a fight we can't win with our fists." As the sheriff snapped cuffs onto Caleb's wrists, a bitter echo of the chains she had removed, Esther felt a cold, hard knot of rage form in her stomach. They had survived the thugs. They had survived Vance. But now they were facing something far more dangerous. The law, twisted into a weapon of the rich. As Sheriff Brody led Caleb away, Caleb looked back at her one last time. He mouthed a single word: "Run." But Esther wasn't a runner. She watched them disappear over the ridge, the sheriff and his prisoner, her protector, stolen from her by a piece of paper, and a man with a badge. The word Caleb had mouthed echoed in her mind. Run. He wanted her to save herself, to flee before Silas Croft's long shadow fell completely over her small homestead. But where would she run? This cabin, this small patch of hard-won earth, was all she had in the world. It was the last piece of Walter she had left. And now, it was a part of Caleb too. His sweat and his blood were in its soil. No, running was what the old Esther would have done. The timid, grieving widow. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had stared down armed men and swung a skillet like a battle axe. Rage, cold and pure, burned away her fear. Croft had taken her guardian. He thought he had won. He thought she was just a helpless woman, an insignificant loose end. He was about to find out how wrong he was. She spent the rest of the day thinking. Not grieving, not despairing. Thinking. She couldn't fight Croft's army of lawyers and paid-off lawmen. She couldn't fight his money. But Croft and his kind had a weakness. They were arrogant. They underestimated the people they stepped on. And Caleb had said something important. "I saw too much. I learned his secrets." If Caleb knew Croft's secrets, then somewhere there had to be proof. She started in the cabin. She searched every inch of Caleb's few belongings. The threadbare blanket, the mended shirt, nothing. It was hopeless. What could a man on the run carry with him? She sank onto the porch steps, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of blood and bruises. Defeat tasted like ash in her mouth. Her eyes fell on the woodpile. The perfect, neat stack Caleb had built for her that first morning. It was a testament to his methodical nature. He did everything with a purpose. She stared at it, a strange feeling prickling at the back of her neck. Why was it stacked so perfectly? Walter had always just thrown the logs into a heap. She walked over to it. The logs were stacked in a precise interlocking pattern, like bricks in a wall. Solid, stable. Her eyes traced the lines of the wood, and then she saw it. One log near the bottom was different. It wasn't a log at all. It was a hollowed-out cylinder of wood, its end capped with a carefully fitted plug. It was so skillfully made, it was nearly invisible. Her heart started to pound. With trembling fingers, she worked it free from the stack. The plug was tight, sealed with wax to keep out the moisture. She ran back to the cabin, grabbed a knife, and pried it open. Inside was a small, tightly rolled bundle of oilcloth. She unrolled it on the table. It was a ledger. Caleb's handwriting, small and precise, filled the pages. It was a detailed record of every dirty deal, every bribe, every act of violence Silas Croft had ordered over the past 5 years. Names, dates, payoffs to judges, sheriffs, and senators, and a detailed account of a plan to illegally seize water rights from small homesteads all along the new railway line. Homesteads that had been cleared out by accidents and Indian raids that were anything but. She scanned the last few pages, her blood running cold. There it was, her own small plot of land, listed next to her husband's name, Walter Hale. And next to his name, a single chilling entry. Problem resolved. Fever. Cost, $100. Walter hadn't died of a fever. He'd been murdered. Poisoned by a company doctor on Croft's payroll, all for the small spring that trickled at the back of her property. A spring that was apparently the key to Croft controlling the entire valley. This ledger wasn't just proof of Caleb's innocence. It was the key to destroying Silas Croft. But the sheriff who had arrested Caleb was on the payroll. The judge was on the payroll. Handing this over to the local authorities would be a death sentence. She needed to get it to someone Croft couldn't buy, a federal marshal, the territorial governor, someone far away from redemption. She looked at the ledger, this small book that held the truth. Caleb hadn't just been preparing for a fight. He had been preparing for this exact moment. He hadn't just been a fighter. He'd been a soldier gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had trusted her to find it. She had his weapon. Now she had to go to war. She knew she couldn't stay. Croft's men would be back, not to arrest her, but to silence her, to burn the cabin and the last witness with it. She packed a small bag, food, water, Walter's old compass, and the ledger wrapped securely and hidden in the bottom of the sack. She had to leave the homestead, the last piece of her old life. But she wasn't sad. She was focused. Every step she took was for Walter. Every mile she traveled was for Caleb. She decided to head east, towards the territorial capital in Cheyenne. It was a long, dangerous journey on foot, but she knew the railway lines would be watched. She had to take the back roads, the forgotten trails. As she took one last look at the cabin, bathed in the pale moonlight, a flicker of movement in the distance caught her eye. Torches. A half-dozen of them, moving steadily towards her property. They were coming back for her, and they weren't planning on leaving any witnesses this time. Her blood ran cold. She had stayed too long. She slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the tall grass and shadows just as the first of Croft's men burst through the gate. They weren't lawmen. They were the same kind of thugs Vance had hired, but more of them, and they moved with a grim purpose. She watched from a small rise as they surrounded the cabin. They didn't even bother to check if she was inside. The leader gave a signal, and they tossed their torches onto the dry wood of the porch and roof. The cabin that had been her prison and then her fortress went up in a whoosh of flame. The life she had known was turning to ash before her very eyes. The men stood and watched it burn, their faces illuminated by the destructive glow. They were making sure the job was done. A wave of despair washed over her. The only home she had ever known was gone. But then, she felt the hard outline of the ledger in her sack. They had burned the building. but they hadn't burned the truth. She turned her back on the fire and, with tears of rage freezing on her cheeks, she started walking east. The journey was a special kind of hell. The Wyoming plains were vast and unforgiving. By day, the sun was a merciless hammer. By night, the cold seeped into her bones. Coyotes howled in the distance, a constant lonely chorus. She ate sparingly, rationing the small amount of jerky and hardtack she'd packed. She refilled her canteen at streams, always watching, always listening for the sound of pursuit. She thought about Caleb, sitting in a cell, waiting for a hangman's noose, all because he had trusted her. The thought fueled her, pushing her forward when her body screamed to stop. She thought about Walter, his easy smile, his faith in this land that had ultimately betrayed him. She was his justice now. After 3 days of walking, her boots worn thin and her body aching with exhaustion, she stumbled into a small, dusty settlement. It wasn't much more than a saloon, a general store, and a livery stable. She used one of her few remaining coins to buy a stale piece of bread at the store. The man behind the counter had a kind face, lined with the worries of a hard life. "You look like you're running from something, ma'am," he said quietly. Esther's first instinct was to deny it, to lie, but she was too tired. "Or to something," she replied, her voice hoarse. The man nodded slowly. He looked out the window, a shadow passing over his face. "Lots of folks passing through these days, most of 'em working for the railroad. Mr. Croft's men. Not a pleasant bunch." He slid a small piece of cheese across the counter towards her. "On the house," he whispered. "You look like you need it more than I do." Esther was so overcome with this small act of kindness that she almost broke down. But she held it together. She thanked him and left. She was about to leave town when she saw it. A poster, nailed to the wall of the livery stable. It was a wanted poster, and it had her face on it, a crude sketch, but unmistakably her, Esther Hale, wanted for questioning in the murder of Garrett Vance, accomplice to the fugitive Caleb Donovan, known to be armed and dangerous, $500 reward, $500, a fortune, enough to make any desperate man a bounty hunter. The store owner's kind face flashed in her mind. Had he recognized her? Was he in the saloon right now, gathering men to claim the reward? The world suddenly felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. Croft wasn't just hunting her. He had turned the entire territory against her. She pulled her shawl lower over her face and hurried out of the settlement, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer just a woman seeking justice. She was a fugitive, an outlaw, and every man she met was now a potential enemy. She veered off the main trail, pushing deeper into the wilderness. The wanted poster had changed everything. She couldn't risk another town, another pair of curious eyes. The landscape became harsher, rockier. Her food ran out. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull, grinding pain in her belly. She learned to forage, recognizing the edible berries and roots Walter had once pointed out to her. It wasn't much, but it kept her alive. One evening, huddled by a smokeless fire, she heard the sound of approaching horses. She doused the embers and scrambled behind a rock outcropping, her hand clutching the small, worn knife she carried. 2 men rode into the clearing. They were rough men, bounty hunters by the look of their gear. "She came this way," one of them said, dismounting and studying the ground. "Tracks are fresh. A woman, alone, easy money." The other man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. $500 for one little widow. Croft must want her bad. Let's find her before sunrise. I'm looking forward to collecting." Esther held her breath, pressing herself flat against the cold stone. They were close. So close. They made camp not 50 yards from her hiding place. She was trapped. She couldn't run without them seeing or hearing her. She had to wait them out. She spent the night listening to their crude jokes and snores, every muscle tensed, every nerve screaming. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. Just before dawn, an idea sparked in her exhausted mind. It was a desperate, foolish plan, but it was the only one she had. She waited until they were both asleep, their snores echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. Silently, she crept from her hiding place. She moved like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound on the pine needles. She circled around their camp until she was behind their tethered horses. With her heart in her throat, she took out her knife and sliced through the leather reins of both animals. Then, with a loud shriek and a well-aimed rock at the flank of the nearest horse, she sent them galloping off into the darkness. The bounty hunters woke with a start, cursing and scrambling for their guns. But by the time they realized what had happened, Esther was already gone, melting back into the shadows, putting as much distance as she could between herself and them. She had bought herself time, but she knew they would be on her trail again as soon as they could walk. The chase was far from over. Days blurred into a nightmare of walking, hiding, and hunger. She was getting weaker, her hope starting to fray. Cheyenne felt like a distant, impossible dream. One afternoon, she collapsed by a small stream, her body finally giving out. She had nothing left. She lay there, listening to the gurgle of the water, ready to let the wilderness claim her. This was it. She had failed. Caleb would hang. Croft would win. And then she heard a voice. "You look like you could use some help." She looked up, expecting to see a bounty hunter, a gun pointed at her face. But it was an old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes as clear and bright as the winter sky. She was a native woman, dressed in buckskins, and she held out a piece of dried meat towards Esther. Esther flinched, scrambling backward. "Who are you?" "My name is Bright Star," the woman said, her voice calm and gentle. "And I am not your enemy. The man who hunts you, the one who calls himself Croft, he is the enemy of my people too. He has stolen our land, poisoned our water. Any enemy of his is a friend of mine." Bright Star explained that her tribe had been watching Esther for days. They had seen her flight, her courage. They had seen the bounty hunters, and had led them on a false trail deep into the mountains. "You carry a great burden," Bright Star said, her eyes falling on the sack that held the ledger. "A truth that man fears. We will help you carry it." For the first time in weeks, Esther allowed herself to hope. Bright Star and her people took her in. They fed her, tended to her wounds, and gave her a safe place to rest. They were a small, displaced band of Cheyenne, hiding in the high country, one of the last free tribes in the territory. Their leader, a stoic warrior named Black Wolf, listened intently as Esther, with Bright Star translating, told her story. When she finished, showing him the ledger and the entry about his own people's land, Black Wolf's face was like carved stone. "This paper speaks the truth," he said. "We have fought Croft's men for years. They call us savages, but they are the ones who burn and kill in the night. Your fight is our fight." They gave her a horse, supplies, and a guide, a young sharp-eyed warrior named Little Hawk, to lead her through the secret paths to Cheyenne. Esther rode out of their camp not as a desperate fugitive, but as an emissary, an ally. The journey with Little Hawk was swift and safe. He knew the land like the back of his hand, and they traveled paths that Croft's men would never find. As they crested the last hill overlooking the bustling streets of Cheyenne, Little Hawk stopped. "This is as far as I go," he said. "My world is back there. Yours is in there. Be careful. The snake has many heads, even in the city." Esther thanked him, a deep, profound gratitude in her heart for him and his people. She rode into Cheyenne alone, a dusty, worn figure on a scrappy horse. She looked like just another homesteader, beaten down by the frontier. No one would ever guess she was carrying a bomb, a single book with the power to bring down an empire. She found the office of the territorial governor, a grand brick building that seemed to represent all the power and authority she was about to challenge. Taking a deep breath, clutching the ledger to her chest, she walked up the steps and through the door, ready to face the final battle. The governor's office was opulent, a world away from the dust and hardship of the frontier. A young, dismissive secretary looked Esther up and down, his nose wrinkling at her worn clothes. "The governor is a very busy man," he sniffed. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Esther said, her voice steady. "But I have this." She placed the ledger on the polished mahogany desk. "Tell Governor Bennett that this is the last will and testament of Silas Croft's empire. He will want to see it. And me." Her boldness took the secretary by surprise. He hesitated, then picked up the ledger and disappeared through a set of tall oak doors. Esther waited, her heart pounding. This was the final gamble. Was the governor another one of Croft's puppets, or was he the one honest man she'd been searching for? The minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, the oak doors opened again. The secretary beckoned her in. Governor Bennett was an older man with a stern face and tired eyes. He sat behind a massive desk, the ledger open before him. He looked up as Esther entered, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice a low growl, "this is an extraordinary document, and you are making some extraordinary accusations." "The proof is on those pages, sir," Esther said simply. "Names, dates, crimes that go all the way to the top." The governor steepled his fingers, his eyes never leaving hers. "Silas Croft is one of the most powerful men in this territory. He helped build it. To go against him is to declare war on progress itself. Why should I believe the word of a fugitive over his—" "Because I have nothing to gain and everything to lose," Esther replied, her voice ringing with conviction. "And because you know it's true. You must have heard the whispers, the rumors about how Croft gets his way. This book just confirms it." The governor was silent for a long time, studying her face. He was weighing the risks, the political fallout. "This ledger implicates men in my own administration," he said softly. "It implicates Sheriff Brody, Judge Miller." "Then it is a chance to clean house, Governor," Esther pressed, "to show the people of this territory that the law is for everyone, not just for the rich and powerful." Suddenly, the oak doors burst open. Silas Croft himself strode into the room, flanked by 2 armed guards. He was an imposing figure, impeccably dressed, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Governor," Croft said, his voice smooth as silk, but with an edge of pure steel, "I apologize for the intrusion, but my men informed me a dangerous fugitive had been spotted entering your office. I came to assist in her apprehension." His cold eyes landed on Esther. "Mrs. Hale, you have caused me a great deal of trouble." The governor looked from Croft to Esther, his face unreadable. The moment of truth had arrived. "Silas," the governor said slowly, standing up, "I've been reading some very interesting fiction. A ledger, it seems, detailing your business practices." Croft's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. Forgeries, no doubt. The desperate work of a common criminal. This woman murdered one of my employees. "My husband, Walter Hale, is in that book," Esther said, her voice shaking with rage. "His murder cost you $100. Was he a common criminal too?" Croft's composure finally cracked. A flicker of pure venom showed in his eyes. "Arrest her," he snapped at his men. The guards started forward, but Governor Bennett held up a hand. "No," the governor said, his voice suddenly booming with authority. "There will be no arrests in my office, except one." He walked around his desk and picked up the ledger. "Silas Croft," he said, his voice ringing with newfound resolve. "I have heard the whispers for years. I have turned a blind eye for the sake of progress. But no more. This book, and this woman's courage, have reminded me of my duty." He turned to his secretary. "Get the federal marshals, now." Croft's face went pale. The federal marshals were outside his sphere of influence. He couldn't buy them. He couldn't threaten them. "You're making a grave mistake, Bennett," Croft hissed. "No, Silas," the governor replied, a grim smile on his face. "For the first time in a long time, I am making the right one." The war was over. The snake had been cornered. The fallout was like a tidal wave. With the ledger as their roadmap, the federal marshals dismantled Croft's corrupt network piece by piece. Sheriffs, judges, and politicians were arrested. Croft's empire, built on bribery and blood, crumbled into dust. Silas Croft himself was tried for a list of crimes so long it took the prosecutor a full day to read them. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. The first thing Esther did was secure Caleb's release. She rode back to the jail in redemption with a full pardon from the governor in her hand. When the jailer opened the cell, Caleb stood there, blinking in the sudden sunlight. He looked thinner, weary, but when his eyes found Esther, the light returned to them. He walked out of the jail, a free man in every sense of the word. He didn't speak. He just walked over to her and gently took her hands in his. All the words they needed to say were in that simple touch. Their names were cleared. The wanted posters were torn down. In the town of redemption, they were no longer outcasts. They were heroes. The story of the widow and the fighter who brought down the railroad baron became a local legend. The townspeople, freed from Croft's predatory grip, treated them with a mixture of awe and respect. The store owner who had given her cheese insisted she never pay for supplies again. The government, as compensation for Walter's murder and the loss of her home, granted her full, undisputed title to a much larger plot of land, including the precious spring that had started it all. With the help of their new friends in town and a surprising donation of lumber and tools from the governor's office, they rebuilt the cabin. It was bigger this time, stronger, with a solid stone foundation and a real porch. They rebuilt their lives. The homestead flourished. The garden produced a bounty. The sound of chickens and, eventually, a few cattle brought a new kind of life to the quiet land. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was the easy, comfortable silence of two people who understood each other completely. It was the silence of peace. One evening, months later, they sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set over the plains. The sky was on fire with color. Esther was no longer just a widow. She was a warrior, a queen of her own small, peaceful kingdom. Caleb was no longer just a fighter. He was a guardian, a builder, a free man who had found a home. He turned to her, a small, genuine smile on his face. It was a rare and beautiful sight. "You know," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I never did thank you properly." "For what?" she asked. "For the $5, he said. "Best money I ever saw spent." She smiled, a real, deep smile that reached her eyes. "I agree." They had faced down corruption, violence, and the wild heart of the frontier. They had lost everything and gained so much more. Together, in a quiet corner of an unforgiving world, a widow and a fighter had found something they'd both thought was lost forever: redemption. If you enjoyed this story of justice and unexpected courage, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the shadows of history.